I didn't cry when my father served me with court papers. I didn't call anyone. I sat at my kitchen table, read every page twice, and made myself a cup of coffee. That's the part people always find strange. They expect me to say I fell apart, and maybe a different version of me would have. The version who was 19 and handed over her first paycheck because her stepmother said the electric bill was overdue. The version who was 22 and skipped her own work retreat because her father guilted her into driving her half-brother to a tournament 3 states away. That version of me cried all the time. She thought that if she was useful enough, eventually she'd feel like she belonged. By the time those papers landed on my table, I was 31. I was a forensic accountant, and I had been quietly preparing for something like this for almost 4 years. Let me back up because the court papers didn't come out of nowhere. Nothing in my family ever does. Everything gets built slowly, layer by layer, until one day you look up and realize the ceiling is 6 inches from your face. My parents divorced when I was 8. My father remarried within 2 years. A woman I'll call my stepmother. Though that word has always felt too warm for what she actually was. She had a son from her previous relationship, my half-brother, who was 4 years younger than me, and had never, in his entire life, been told no. I want to be fair. I don't think my father is an evil person. I think he fell in love with a woman who made him feel important, and he made a series of small choices that added up to one very large betrayal. Every individual decision had a reason. Taken together, they built a machine that ran on me. I was the reliable one. That was my identity from the time I was 12. I got good grades without being asked. I worked part-time through high school. When I was 17, my grandmother, my mother's mother, put a substantial amount of money into an education trust for me. $50,000. She had saved it over decades, a little at a time, in a credit union account she kept separate from everything else. She told me it was mine for school and for getting started in life, and that I should never let anyone tell me otherwise. I didn't tell my father about it for almost 6 months. When I finally did, during a weekend visit, he seemed genuinely happy for me. He hugged me. He said Grandma had always had her head on straight. The money was gone by the time I was 19. Not spent by me. My father had convinced me, over a series of conversations that I now recognize as a careful, calculated campaign, that lending him $40,000 from the trust would save the family home. His words exactly, save the family home. My stepmother's business had hit a rough patch, he said. The mortgage was 3 months behind. They'd pay me back within a year with interest. He showed me paperwork. There was a promissory note. It looked official. I was a teenager who trusted her father, and I signed it. They never paid back a single dollar. When I brought it up at 21, my stepmother told me I was being selfish. When I brought it up at 23, my father said he didn't remember it that way. When I was 25 and had been working for 2 years at an accounting firm, I went to a lawyer on my lunch break, without telling anyone, and I asked her what I could do. She was kind. She looked at the promissory note and told me the terms were enforceable, but the practical reality was difficult. Civil litigation against a family member. Potentially years. Money I'd spend recovering money I was owed. She said to think carefully about what outcome I actually wanted. I thought about it for a long time, and I decided I didn't want a courtroom fight at 25. What I wanted was information. What I wanted was to understand exactly what had happened and to document all of it so that if anything ever came up again, and with my family I knew something would, I would be ready. I opened a folder on my personal laptop. I called it House Records. Inside it, I began to place everything. The original promissory note, scanned, every text message and email in which my father referenced the loan, a timeline I built myself, with dates and amounts, the name of the credit union, the account statements my grandmother had sent me before she passed. I added to that folder over the next several years. It wasn't obsessive. It was methodical. There's a difference. I went to work every day. I made friends. I got promoted. I bought a small house at 28 with money I had saved entirely on my own. That house became the next target. My half-brother was 24 when he got engaged. His fiancée came from a family with money, and from what I could piece together, that family was not impressed by his financial situation. My half-brother had never held a steady job for more than 8 months. He had credit card debt that I later found out exceeded $60,000. He needed to look stable. He needed an asset. The asset they chose was my house. I found out through a cousin who heard it at a family dinner I hadn't attended. Apparently, my father and stepmother have been telling people that my house was purchased with family money, meaning money they had contributed, and that my half-brother had some claim to it as a family asset. It was completely untrue. My down payment came from 5 years of my own savings. My name was the only name on the deed. That they had been saying this long enough that several family members believed it. I want to describe the specific feeling I had when I heard this. It wasn't rage, it was something quieter and colder. Recognition almost, like seeing a pattern in a spreadsheet that you've been staring at for a long time, and suddenly knowing exactly what the number at the bottom was going to be. I called no one. I made no changes to my routine. I went to work that Monday and sat in on a deposition, and that night I opened my laptop and began to add to my folder again. I already had the deed to my house, but I did something else that week that I had been meaning to do for a while. I went to a different attorney, not the one I had consulted years earlier, but a woman who specialized in real estate and estate planning. And I asked her to help me prepare a document, a specific, airtight, notarized document that established the full provenance of my down payment, bank statements, pay stubs, transfer records, a signed statement from my branch manager, all of it attached, all of it notarized, all of it filed with the county. She asked me why I wanted to do this. I told her I liked having clean records. The court papers arrived 8 months later. My father and stepmother had hired an attorney and filed a civil action claiming that I owed the family a sum of money. They listed it as approximately $90,000, representing what they described as years of financial contributions to my well-being, including, specifically, a contribution to the purchase of my home. They were asking the court to place a lien on my property. My half-brother's name was not on the filing, but I recognized the fingerprints. I read the papers twice, then I called my attorney. She had been my attorney for 8 months by this point, and she had all my documents. When I told her what had been filed, there was a pause on the line, and then she said, "Okay, I think we're going to be all right." We met 2 days later, and she walked me through their claim piece by piece. Most of it was vague, the kind of vague that sounds impressive until someone starts asking for specifics. Their central argument hinged on the idea that my father had made a substantial financial contribution to my life, and that contribution entitled him to recover funds now that I had assets. The problem with their argument was the promissory note. The $40,000 they had borrowed from my grandmother's education trust and never repaid predated any alleged contribution to my well-being by years. Under the terms of the note, with interest, the amount owed to me had grown. When my attorney calculated it out, including the statutory interest rate for our estate over the full period of non-payment, they owed me more than I allegedly owed them. That was layer 1. Layer 2 was the documentation package I had prepared with my attorney 8 months earlier. Every cent of my down payment was accounted for. There was no family money in my house. There had never been any family money in my house. My father had not contributed so much as a single dollar to its purchase. Layer 3 was something I had found on my own during the months after I heard the rumors at the family dinner. While reviewing old records, I discovered that my stepmother had, at some point, used my social security number to open a store credit account. I hadn't noticed it because the balance had been paid and the account closed within a year, and I hadn't been checking my credit closely at the time. But it was there in the history. Unauthorized use. My number, her account, without my knowledge or consent. I had reported it to the credit bureaus quietly 8 months ago. I had also, on the advice of my attorney, filed a report with the FTC. I had not told my father or stepmother. I had simply documented it and waited. My attorney told me she wanted to request mediation before the court date. She said she could contact their attorney and propose a meeting. A settlement conference. Just both parties and their counsel in a neutral space to discuss resolution. I agreed. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning at my attorney's office. I took the day off work. I wore a suit I had bought for depositions. Gray, structured, nothing memorable. I got there 20 minutes early and sat in the conference room and looked at the wall. My father and stepmother arrived exactly on time. My half-brother was not there. My father looked older than I remembered. My stepmother did not look at me when she came in. Their attorney opened. He presented their claim with confidence. He spoke about family contributions, about the nature of financial support within a family unit, about my father's years of involvement in my life, and the reasonable expectation of reciprocity. It was polished. It was also entirely dependent on things that were not true. When he finished, my attorney thanked him. Then she opened a folder and placed a single document on the table. The promissory note. She explained what it was. She explained when it was signed, what the terms were, and how much principal and interest had accrued over the years of non-repayment. She placed a second sheet next to it. The calculation. The number was not small. Their attorney looked at his clients. My father was looking at the table. My stepmother had gone very still. My attorney continued. She placed my documentation package on the table, the bank statements, the transfer records, the notarized statement from my branch manager. She explained that there was no traceable family contribution to my home purchase and invited them to identify any specific transaction they could point to as evidence of their claim. There was silence. Then she placed the third document on the table. She explained that during the preparation of my case, I had discovered an unauthorized use of my social security number. She named the account. She named the date range. She explained that I had filed a report with the FTC and that the documentation had been preserved. She said nothing further. She simply let it sit there. The room was quiet for a long time. Their attorney asked for a recess. He took my father and stepmother into the hallway. I sat in the conference room with my attorney, and she poured me a glass of water, and we did not say anything to each other, because there was nothing to say. They were gone for 22 minutes. When they came back, their attorney said his clients wished to explore a resolution. My attorney said she was glad to hear it. She outlined the terms I was willing to accept, the civil action to be withdrawn with prejudice, a signed document acknowledging that I had no financial obligations to either of them, a full release of any future claims related to the alleged contributions. In exchange, I would not pursue the outstanding debt on the promissory note through the courts, and I would not refer the identity theft matter to the State Attorney General's Office for criminal review. That last part was not a bluff. My attorney had already made contact with that office. She had simply not filed anything yet. That was my choice to make. Their attorney said he needed time to advise his clients on the terms. My attorney said we would give him until end of business Friday. He called Thursday afternoon. They signed everything the following week. The civil action was withdrawn. The release was executed. I watched my attorney scan and file all of it. And then I drove home on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I sat in my kitchen, and I looked at the backyard. I have a redbud tree back there. I planted it the first spring after I moved in. It's small still, but it blooms every April, and I have a photo of it from each of the 3 springs I've lived here. And every year the color is a little more vivid than the year before. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about her credit union account and how she had added to it a little at a time, for years, for me. She died when I was 26. I never got to tell her what had happened to that money. I never got to tell her that I got it back, not the dollars themselves, but something equivalent, something I earned by being exactly as careful and patient as she was. My father has not contacted me since the signing. My stepmother has not contacted me either. My half-brother sent a text 3 weeks later that said I had nothing to do with this. I read it once and put my phone face down on the counter and went back to the book I was reading. The engagement fell through. I heard that from the same cousin who told me about the dinner. I don't know the details, and I didn't ask. I want to say something for anyone watching this who's in the part of the story I was in at 22 or 25, the part where you know something is wrong, but you can't see the end of it yet. Document everything. Not because you're planning to go to war, just because information is the one thing that belongs entirely to you, and no one can borrow it without your permission and forget to pay it back. The red bud bloomed again last April. I took a picture. The color was the deepest it's ever been. There's a redbud tree in my backyard that I planted the first spring after I moved in. I think about it a lot when I think about how any of this happened. Not the lawsuit, not the mediation, but the longer story underneath all of it, the one that started decades before a single document was ever filed. My grandmother saved money for me the way she did everything, quietly, consistently, without needing anyone to notice. She didn't make speeches about it. She just added to that account a little at a time, year after year, because she believed I deserved a real start. That kind of integrity, the kind that doesn't require an audience, is something I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. She never got to see what happened to her money, but I think she would have understood what I did with what she taught me. What I did at its core was simple. I paid attention. I kept records. I didn't act out of anger when I was 22 and the hurt was fresh. I waited until I understood the full picture, and then I prepared for it. My profession helped. I know how to read numbers, how to trace a transaction, how to build a paper trail that holds up. But the instinct behind it wasn't professional. It was something I learned from watching a woman quietly deposit money into a credit union account for 20 years. You protect what matters by being more careful than the people who are trying to take it. What I want to say to anyone who's in the middle of a version of this story is that the outcome I got wasn't luck, and it wasn't magic. It was the product of making a series of boring, unglamorous decisions over a long period of time. Saving my own money instead of waiting for someone to provide for me. Opening a folder and putting documents in it even when I didn't know if I'd ever need them. Consulting an attorney before there was a crisis, not during one. None of those things felt powerful in the moment. They felt like maintenance, but they accumulated into something that held. There's a version of me that stayed stuck, that spent the next decade relitigating the grief of being the child who was taken from, who was used, who was never quite seen as a full person in her own family. I understand that version. I was her for a long time. But at some point, I made a choice to put my energy into building something real rather than into the wound itself. That choice didn't come from being noble. It came from being tired. And from understanding, slowly, that no one was coming to correct what had been done to me. If I wanted something different, I had to construct it myself. The red bud bloomed again this April. I took a picture. I do it every year. I don't speak to my father or my stepmother anymore. That's not a decision I made in anger. It's a decision I made the way I make most decisions now. Carefully, after a long time, with full knowledge of what I was choosing and what I was letting go. Some relationships reach the end of what they can be. Accepting that isn't bitterness. It's just honesty. My grandmother was honest like that. She knew who could be trusted and who couldn't, and she acted accordingly. And she never made a drama out of it. I think that's the thing I'm most grateful to have inherited from her. Not the $50,000, though I'm grateful for that too, but the understanding that integrity is mostly just a long series of small, quiet choices that nobody applauds you for. You make them anyway. That's the whole point.